Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estás? Welcome back to Spanish Lessons with Professor Jason. In today's lesson, I'll be talking about what's probably the most mysterious and complex of all Spanish verb tenses. That's right, I'm referring to the present perfect or the pluperfect subjunctive. Now we're going to go over both the forms and several uses of the present perfect subjunctive, but hopefully by the time we're finished, you'll have it all straight. So we've got a lot to talk about. Let's go ahead and get started. Empecemos. Alright, just to give you a little bit clearer idea of what to expect in today's lesson, here's our lesson overview slide. I'm going to start off by talking about what's meant by the past perfect time frame. Then I'm going to go into a little bit the nomenclature, the terminology. We have different terms in English and Spanish to refer to the past perfect. Then I'm going to demonstrate how to form the past perfect subjunctive forms, show you a little bit on the whiteboard, and I'm going to finish up the lesson by going into four distinct circumstances or situations in which the past perfect subjunctive is used. Alright, let's take a look at our first topic then. So, just what is the past perfect or pluperfect time frame? We'll take a look at the 6 examples, or the 3 examples in English with their Spanish equivalents on this slide. Alright, we had won 6 games, or nosotros habíamos ganado 6 partidos. They had seen that movie already. Ellos ya habían visto esa película. He hadn't given me the check yet. Él todavía no me había dado el cheque. So notice first that these are compound verb forms in both languages. We have an auxiliary verb, to have or haber, which is conjugated in a past form. And on this slide, I'm just looking at the past perfect indicative. We haven't got to the subjunctive yet. So to back up a little bit, we have a compound verb form, right? An auxiliary verb, to have, or its equivalent, haber, conjugated in a past form, followed by a past participle, what you might call the main verb. So these verb forms convey the idea that as of a certain point in the past, something else had already happened, or hadn't happened yet. So that idea of already or yet, those are kind of implicit when we use the past perfect time frame. But I think you can get the idea just by going over these examples on the slide. These are typical of when we need to use past perfect verb forms. Now in English, we usually call this time frame and the corresponding verb forms or verb tense the past perfect or maybe the pluperfect. Spanish textbooks usually use the same English labels to refer to the equivalent forms in Spanish. In Spanish, however, the terminology we most often use to refer to these forms is pretérito pluscuamperfecto or simply pluscuamperfecto. If we add the subjunctive mood to the mix, the labels in English become the past perfect subjunctive or the pluperfect subjunctive, and of course you can talk about the indicative or subjunctive. In Spanish, this is usually called the pretérito pluscuamperfecto de subjuntivo, or more simply, I wouldn't say simply, but more simply, the pluscuamperfecto de subjuntivo. Now, the reason it's important to know what these verb forms are called in English and Spanish is that if you want to look up more information on them online, for example, you need to be using the right search terms. Okay, now let's take a closer look at how to form and when to use the past perfect subjunctive. You can see that I've prepared a slide here, and I'm going to leave it up on the screen, or you can pause the video for a couple of minutes if you want to take notes or commit some of this to memory. But what I'm going to do is I've recorded a short video using the whiteboard because I think that technique sometimes is a little bit more helpful. So let's go to the whiteboard. So just as a lead-in to our discussion about forming the past perfect subjunctive, I'm going to write a phrase in the past perfect subjunctive. Si yo hubiera sabido. Don't worry too much about what that means. We'll talk about uses here in a moment, but I just want to show you the structure of this. We're going to start with, of course, the personal pronoun or the subject position, right? We also see here that we have the imperfect subjunctive form of haber. So we're conjugating haber, the auxiliary verb haber, in the imperfect subjunctive. And remember, the imperfect subjunctive forms are generated by taking the third person plural, right, which is like saying ellos, which on my list would probably be down here somewhere. The third person plural form of the preterite, which in the case of haber would be
hubieron, and then we remove the final two letters, and there are specific endings for that, right? So hubiera, hubieras, hubiera. So I'll come back to that in just a second. That's where that comes from. So again, we have yo, person, hubiera or haber in the imperfect subjunctive, and then this form here with the verb saber, in this case, to know, right? If I had known, to know. Well, the form we have here is the past participle, right? So the past participle form, which are those forms that end in ado, most often ido, right? And you have some irregular forms such as, for example, dicho from the verb decir, hecho from the verb hacer, or what else? Visto, ver, right? Or even vuelto, devolver. So those are the components, right? We have obviously the subject position, who we're talking about, the verb haber conjugated in the imperfect subjunctive, and then the main verb, which in this case is to know, saber, the past participle form of that, and those are the ones that are usually ending in ado or ido. Okay, so that's where we're coming from, so to speak. Okay, so let's put this down a little bit more systematically for you. Under the subject or the pronoun positions in the subject, right, we have, of course, yo, we have tú, we have the third person or the subjects that take a third person verb form, such as usted or él or ella, right? We have nosotros, first person plural, or nosotras. We have vosotros, which in Spain means you guys, vosotras, the feminine form. Then, of course, we have you all, you guys in Latin America, ustedes, and ellos, ellas. Okay? So again, those are the subject positions you're familiar with. Then we have the auxiliary verb haber, right? We said on the previous slides, we're going to use the imperfect subjunctive form of haber. Entonces, in the yo form, it's yo hubiera, tú hubieras, okay? Usted, él, ella, Juan, María, hubiera, okay? Nosotros, this one has an accent, a written accent, hubiéramos, hubiéramos. Vosotros, hubierais, okay? Ustedes, or ellos, ellas. My U's are not looking much like U's. Hubieran, okay? So those are the imperfect subjunctive forms of the verb haber. And then that third element we talked about for forming this verb time frame, right, is the past participle form of the main verb. So let's say our verb is an AR verb like hablar, right? Hablado. So I would say something like, tú hubieras hablado. Remember, this form is fixed. The endings don't change. Or, nosotros hubiéramos hablado, right? If it's an ER verb, such as comer, right, it's going to end in the sound ido, comido, right? That form is invariable. So, you guys had eaten, vosotros hubierais comido, or you guys had eaten Latin America or Spain formally, ustedes hubieran comido. And then remember, AR verbs use the same ending. So take a verb like abrir, right? Past participle form is, oops, actually, that one's irregular. Abierto. Scratch that. Let me think of, okay, beber. Still a good one to learn, right? Beber, right? Bebidos. If I wanted to say that you had, now I got myself into a problem here because I may not know the irregular English form. Drunk, right? Tú hubieras bebido, that you had drunk. Or que hubiéramos bebido. Okay? So, hado, ido, and irregulars. And again, let me just review a few more irregular forms for you, right? So, for example, we saw these just a second ago, but just to, also remember ser, right? And estar. So, sido, hubiera sido, hubierais sido, and estado, right? This one I guess you could say is regular. But some irregulars to remember, well, we just saw abrir, abierto, abierto. How about the verb hacer, right? The irregular past participle form is hecho, right? How about decir, okay? Shout it out if you know it. Dicho, okay? Or another very common verb, ver, to see. Irregular past participle form is visto. Tú hubieras visto, yo hubiera visto. And then one more, to return or to go back, volver. Oops, volver, vuelto. Okay, so that's what we're doing. We're taking our subject position, subject pronoun, combining it with the auxiliary verb haber in the imperfect subjunctive, hubiera, hubieras, hubiera, hubiéramos, hubierais, hubieran, adding the past participle form of the main verb, the action we're actually talking about. That's how you form the imperfect subjunctive. Or, excuse me, the past perfect subjunctive. The past perfect subjunctive.
Okay, now we've come to the final part of the lesson, the part you've been waiting for, or maybe not, but we're going to talk about 4 specific uses of the past perfect subjunctive forms in Spanish. The first one you can see on this slide is by far the most common use of past perfect subjunctive forms, and that's in hypothetical or contrary to fact if-then statements. These are the kind that express the idea that if X had happened, or if X had done Y, then Z would have or would not have happened. So it's very complex. The past perfect subjunctive form is used in the if clause, in other words, after the word si, whereas the then clause usually uses the conditional perfect, which, as you can see from the examples, is habría, habrías, habríamos, etc., plus the past participle form. So let's take a look at these first 2 examples, right? If I had earned more money, that if clause is contrary to fact. I did not, then hypothetically I would have bought a larger house. So, like I said, right after if, we have the imperfect subjunctive, or the past perfect or pluperfect subjunctive, I should say. If I had earned more money, I would have bought a larger house. Si yo hubiera ganado más dinero, habría comprado una casa más grande. Habría comprado there is our conditional perfect, right? Hubiera ganado is the past perfect or pluperfect subjunctive, the reason we're here today. Another example, if the weather had been nicer, we would have gone to the beach. Si hubiera hecho mejor tiempo, habríamos ido a la playa. Now, one thing I wanted to point out here on this slide about the same use, contrary to fact or hypothetical if-then statements, is that the if and the then statement can be flipped in terms of the order of the sentence. So I can have the then statement before the if statement. Okay, so look at these examples. We would have understood, that's the conditional perfect part. We would have understood this if the professor's explanations had been clearer. That's your if clause. That's your contrary to fact. They weren't clearer, but had they been clearer. So, habríamos entendido esto si las explicaciones del profesor hubieran sido más claras. So, instead of coming at the beginning of the sentence, our if clause is at the end. Another example of sort of this flipped clause order. I would have visited his friends. That's the conditional perfect. Habría visitado. I would have visited his friends if, remember the subjunctive comes after the if they had lived closer, which they didn't. Yo habría visitado a sus amigos si hubieran vivido más cerca. So I could flip that back to sort of maybe the more frequent order, right? And said something like, si sus amigos hubieran vivido más cerca, yo los habría visitado. Okay. Now the final example, I've put a space between on the side because I wanted to draw a little extra attention to it, shows that sometimes natives, many times actually, in many different dialects around the Spanish-speaking world, native speakers, instead of using the conditional perfect in the then clause, will use the pluperfect subjunctive or past perfect subjunctive in both clauses. I've put an asterisk here to signal that this isn't necessarily grammatical or, in terms of prescriptive grammars, but it is very colloquial, or native speakers use it a lot. So, If I had known the truth, that's our if clause, right? Si yo hubiera sabido la verdad, I would not have said anything. No hubiera dicho nada. When it maybe should be, no habría dicho nada. But many native speakers will just put both clauses in the imperfect subjunctive. So you may have heard that, and it might clash a little bit with something you might have learned in class, but it's idiomatic. It's what native speakers say. If I had known the truth, si hubiera sabido la verdad, no hubiera dicho nada. No habría dicho nada. Okay, just wanted to point that out. Okay, let's move on to past perfect subjunctive use number 2, and that is that less commonly, the past perfect subjunctive is used in subordinate clauses when the main clause verb denotes a past time frame and communicates an idea, or semantically communicates an idea that triggers the subjunctive mode, right? So it could be persuasion or volition, you want or need someone to do something, doubt, you're not sure, or you doubt that someone will do something, uncertainty, an emotional response, etc. Those types of main clause ideas that trigger the subjunctive in subordinate clauses, right? So in these cases, the verb in the subordinate clause has to refer to a past perfect time frame. In other words, it has to carry that idea that somebody had done already or hadn't done yet. You have to hear, sort of, if you're thinking in English, you have to hear that had in there, not just the simple past did. So let's look at some examples that illustrate this subordinate clause use of the past perfect subjunctive. I doubted, that's in the past. That's my main clause verb. That triggers the subjunctive. I doubted that they had called already. Yo dudaba que ellos hubieran llamado. Dudaba que ellos hubieran llamado. She didn't believe. That semantic meaning in that main clause means that what comes after it needs to be expressed in the subjunctive mood, right? She didn't believe. Ella no creía que yo hubiera ganado el concurso. Que yo hubiera ganado el concurso. Again, using the past perfect subjunctive because in my English thinking brain, I hear had won. Had. Hubiera ganado el concurso. And then an example with an emotional or subjective response triggering the subjunctive. Here in an impersonal expression. It surprised us. Nos sorprendió que. Surprised us that she had failed the exam. Had failed, not just failed. Had failed. Nos sorprendió que ella hubiera reprobado el examen. Now, just a second ago I said the second reason or the second use was less common. And the reason I said less common or less commonly is that if you're not talking about a true past perfect scenario, right, in that dependent or subordinate clause, what comes after K, if you don't hear in your English thinking brain had done something, right, then in most cases you want to use the more straightforward imperfect subjunctive rather than the pluperfect or past perfect subjunctive. Okay, so if the time frame is not past perfect, had done something, we're going to most of the time use the imperfect subjunctive like in these examples. Look at the first one. I wanted him to do it, not that he had done it. So, yo quería que él lo hiciera instead of hubiera hecho. Quería que él lo hiciera. It's a little bit simpler, straightforward. It was incredible that you played so well. Not that you had played, but that you played so well. Fue increíble que jugaras tan bien. She wasn't happy that he arrived so late. A ella no le gustó que él llegara tan tarde. A ella no le gustó que él llegara tan tarde. Perhaps a good rule of thumb is that if you can get the idea across without invoking a past perfect time frame, use the more straightforward imperfect subjunctive forms that you see on this slide. Okay, let's look at the third use, or third common use anyways, of the past perfect subjunctive. This is after ojalá, when we want to express the wish that something in the past had happened or turned out differently. Take a look at the examples, I think it'll make sense. So if I wanted to say kind of like, I wish they'd invited us, I might say, ojalá que nos hubieran invitado. Ojalá que nos hubieran invitado. I can leave out the K in this usage and just say, ojalá nos hubieran invitado. I wish they'd invited us. Or, I wish it hadn't rained so much. I can use the que or I can leave it out. I wish it hadn't rained so much. Ojalá no hubiera llovido tanto. Ojalá no hubiera llovido tanto. I wish you'd told me. I wish you'd told me. Ojalá me hubieras dicho. Ojalá me hubieras dicho. Right? Or maybe, I wish you had listened to me. Ojalá me hubieras escuchado. Ojalá me hubieras escuchado. So this is a very common use of the past perfect subjunctive, right? After ojalá, to express the wish that something had happened or turned out differently. Similarly, past perfect subjunctive can be used colloquially, and often is, to express the idea that somebody really should have done something that they didn't do. Now, unless this is conveyed with a clearly sarcastic tone, it will come across as a pretty severe reprimand or reproach. So if you hear this coming at you, know that the person probably is annoyed with you. So a scenario might be something like, somebody showed up at my door early on a Saturday morning and I wasn't expecting visitors, and so I might say, man, you really should have called me first. Me hubieras llamado antes, or just hubieras llamado antes. Often the indirect object pronoun that you're directing the enunciation to is dropped off because it's usually, me or te, it's obvious. Or maybe I walked into a situation and I didn't know a bit of information, and I might say, wow, you really should have told me, right? Hubieras dicho, or me hubieras dicho, right? Or you guys really should have warned me, right? Pucha, me hubieran avisado, me hubieran avisado. So this is another fairly frequent idiomatic colloquial use of the past perfect subjunctive to tell somebody that they really should have done something that they didn't do. Alright, that concludes my presentation on the forms and uses of the past perfect or pluperfect subjunctive in Spanish. Hope you found it to be informative and useful. Of course, as always, I welcome your comments, questions, or suggestions, so please take a minute and let me know what you thought. Hope you'll also visit my website, professorjason.com, and be sure to like and follow me on all your social media. I'll put my accounts up on the screen in just a second. Thanks again for watching. That's it for today, and I'll see you at the next lesson. Hasta pronto. Ciao.